Welcome to everyone. We're waiting that people are coming in. So many people are joining the call, so we will wait for 1 or 2 minutes before starting. Welcome to the people who are joining us. Some people are still joining, so we will wait for 1 more minute. So welcome everyone to this session on the SDG 6 years later. Before we start, allow me to give you some housekeeping rules. So the webinar is recorded and I will share the slides and the recording afterwards. We will have a Q&A session at the end. And if you experience any technical issue, please use the chat. So I'm Eglantine Coates. I'm responsible at the Shift for the partnership with B Corp and the topics work and inclusion. Today, we will learn about the worldwide and Belgian evolution on the SDG after 6 years. Which goals are on track? What are the main challenges? And how did the COVID crisis impact the SDGs? We have the great chance to have as speaker Grayson Fuller, senior analyst, and Finn Wulm, a research coordinator for data science and research at SDSN, so the Sustainable Development Solution Network. They are both a co-author of the Sustainable Development Report 2021, and the report is published every year in June, and it tracks the progress of the all 193 UN member states on the SDGs. So as I said before, we will have a Q&A session at the end. Thank you very much, Grayson and Finn, to be with us today, and I will give you the floor.
Thank you, Eglantine. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I think we can maybe start off with some introductions. So I'm Grayson, senior analyst at SDSN. I've been at SDSN for 4 years, and I work mostly on the data for our different reports that track the progress of the SDGs. Finn, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Finn. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for taking the time. It's great to see that so many of you are interested in SDGs. I'm the coordinator for data science and research at SDSN. I work very closely with Grayson, contributing to our SDG index, and then also working on our data visualizations and interactive web portals.
And with that, I will just share my screen. Okay, do you see this okay? Yep, okay, perfect. So for today's presentation, I will start off by giving a quick overview of what we do with the SDSN and the SDG Index or Sustainable Development Report in general, as well as a quick overview of our methodology, very basic overview. And then my colleague Finn will take us more in detail about the detailed results for this year. So the SDSN was launched in 2012 at the initiative of the then Secretary General to help mobilize science and research to implement the SDGs. So we're not an official UN institution, but we do operate under the auspices of the UN. So this is a neat sort of setup because it means we're allowed to do some things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do if we were an official organ, for example, ranking countries. But at the same time, we still have that sort of close relationship with the UN and official processes. So if I were to describe the SDSN, I would say we have sort of three primary pillars. The first and most important is that we're a network of knowledge institutions that work on localizing SDGs in their countries and building solutions targeted at their specific countries. So we have coverage all around the globe, as you can see on our map. We have a mix of national networks and also regional networks. Then the sort of second pillar is the SDG Academy, which is our pedagogical branch at the institution, which provides freelance courses in different domains of sustainable development. And lastly, we are sort of a think tank, and we work on constructing and advancing knowledge in terms of sustainable development. And it is in this domain here that me and Finn work on the sustainable development reports. So the Sustainable Development Report, why do we do this report? I would say first, we have the sort of commitment side aspect of things. So we want to hold countries accountable for their commitments to meeting the SDGs. And I mean, as we'll see later on, there's several key differences between our report and official monitoring processes. So as you all know, there's official SDG indicators, but it's a bit complicated. There's more than 200 of them. Many of them don't have established methodologies for reporting data. Many of them just aren't frequently collected on data by countries. And so we come in with a sort of simpler indicator framework. Secondly, we aim to support national debates on where countries should prioritize efforts, meaning SDGs. And so you'll see the main thing that allows us to do this is evaluating distance to targets. So the fact that we can say that countries are here and they should be here, you can see how much distance countries need to go and where they need to really accelerate their efforts to meet the target by 2030. And lastly, we aim to establish SDGs as a sort of concrete and really palpable tool for policy action. So instead of just broad overarching goals, you have really specific indicators to know what actions you need to take to meet the SDGs. So that's the first pillar. Secondly, I would say we are also complementing efforts to strengthen data availability. So we work closely with institutions such as Eurostat, UNSD, and different national statistical offices to provide support in sort of enhancing and furthering where data can be used to monitor the SDGs. And so for this, we also use new non-official forms of data, as we'll see later on. So for example, data from peer-reviewed journals from different NGOs that are not necessarily already in the domain of official statistics. So what exactly is the SDG index? So it's something really complicated to really extract. As you might know, a composite index is basically just a tool that summarizes lots of complicated information. So you'll see on the right-hand side page, we have country profiles we publish for each country. You see there's lots of detailed information for each indicator. But what we aim to do is to make this information as useful and understandable as possible. So on the right hand, you have lots of detailed information, and on the left hand, you have what we call aggregated or composite information. So you have country scores, you have country ranks, but the goal of these sort of headline figures is to always do a deeper dive into the data, understand what's really driving these dashboard colors or these overall scores. Then I just also want to take a note to say that we do our overall global sustainable development report that covers all UN member states. But at the same time, we do tons of subnational and regional editions to complement the global sustainable development reports. With regional and subnational editions, we can actually tailor our indicators to more specific and contextual policy challenges. We can use local data sources that we can't otherwise use in the sustainable development report. And specifically in the subnational editions, we can see where there might be territorial disparities in terms of SDG outcomes. So for example, you can imagine that the southern region of a country and the northern region might not have the same SDG outcomes. And so these sort of disparities, you can't see them with national level data. So that's why it's important to always dig into national level aggregates and see where those regions or territories might be having disparities. Okay, so before I dig into our methodology, I will just say that we do have quite a nice reputation in terms of the international community. So we've been statistically audited by the Joint Research Center. This is the scientific body of the European Commission. They're also the experts in composite indices. We've been published in the peer-reviewed literature, so Nature Geoscience, and we're also published every year by Cambridge University Press. Furthermore, our Sustainable Development Report has very great uptake in the actual voluntary national reviews. This year we cited 40%, and this is also why we launch in June of every year. So countries have a chance to look at where they stand in our SDG index so they can use that as part of their reporting to the high-level political forum. Okay, now I'll go in very basic terms of our methodology. So where do our data come from? They come mostly actually from official sources. So the World Bank, ILO, FAO, the World UNESCO, all these organizations that are official bodies of the UN, these are extremely necessary for us to be able to do our report. We would not be able to produce a sustainable development report without these official statistics. And so these indicators that come from these sources, they're harmonized by these bodies. And so we don't have to do the work of collecting the data ourselves from national statistical offices. And it's a very important point that we never actually take data directly from NSOs. So all of these data have already been harmonized and they're made comparable by international institutions. And then secondly, another third of our indicators come from non-official statistics. So for example, peer-reviewed literature or NGOs like Reporters Sans Frontières or the Corruption Perceptions Index. And these indicators, even though they're not official, they're very important because there are some important gaps in official statistics that cover very important domains of SDGs. So for example, spillovers or impacts embodied in our consumption. These sorts of indicators aren't yet in official statistics, but they're extremely important for monitoring sustainable consumption and production. So that's where our data come from. So how do we actually select the indicators that go into the Sustainable Development Report? We have 5 criteria. Our indicators have to be globally relevant, so indicators that are relevant for a broad range of country settings. They have to be timely, so indicators that are regularly updated to have constant monitoring. Statistical validity, so basically indicators that have solid statistical processes and that we can verify the accuracy of. Data coverage, because we need indicators to be available for a lot of countries to avoid missing data bias. And lastly, we want indicators that are normative or where we can say that this should be the target or this constitutes good performance. So for example, in the official SDG indicators, we sometimes have indicators that are descriptive. So for example, the percentage of your economy that's dedicated to manufacturing. These sorts of indicators, we can't set a clear target, so we avoid using these in our Sustainable Development Report. Okay, for the SDG index, what we first do is once we have our indicators, we put them all in the same scale so we can compare performance across indicators. And so for this, we use a min-max formula so that everything is in a range of 0 to 100. So whether it's an indicator of poverty, electricity access, corruption, people that are registered with civil authorities, all of these are put in the same scale of 0 to 100. And this means that once we're on the same scale, we can actually aggregate. So what we do is we take an arithmetic average, and that's how we obtain the goal scores. And for this, we actually use equal weightings just because we don't consider that we can weigh any particular indicator or any particular goal more than any others. So what is the min and the max in this formula? The max, as we'll see in the next slide, is the official and a target that we set for 2030. It's a quantitative target for 2030. And then the minimum value is basically just a strategy to deal with outliers. So it's normally the 2.5th percentile in our distribution of data. And feel free to ask questions about this and then during our Q&A session. I know it might be a bit complicated, or I'm going quite fast through very technical things as well. So for our quantitative targets for 2030, how do we set these? We have a quick decision tree that we use. So firstly, if there's an official SDG target, we use that. Secondly, we use the principle of leave no one behind for indicators, where we can say we should have zero deprivation or universal access. So we want everyone to have access to electricity, to sanitation, to clean water, zero people in poverty, these sorts of indicators. Thirdly, for more scientific indicators like CO2 emissions, we use the consensus in the scientific community. And lastly, we can't use any sort of more official way of setting the targets. We just use the average of the top performers. In our Global Sustainable Development Report, we use the top 5 countries, and in our different editions, the number of countries we use to set the average just depends on the sample size of the countries. So that's SDG index. And to complement the index, we have the dashboards, which provide a sort of visual representation of where countries' priorities lie. So this is just a quick example of a poverty indicator. So you can see we have these quantitative thresholds that we establish using statistical methods and in consultation with experts to say what constitutes SDG attainment and what constitutes really critical SDG challenges. And so once we have these, we have indicator level dashboards, and then we also aggregate these information to have goal level dashboards. And lastly, to complement the SDG index and the dashboards, which mostly focus on where countries are today, we have our SDG trends. And so what this allows us to do is say, okay, so Belgium might be here in 2021, but are they on track to meeting SDGs in 2030? And so for this, we have a methodology where we look at recent past performance since the start of SDGs, and we look at that rate of progress. We look at that rate of progress and we say, okay, is this rate of progress sufficient to meet the SDGs if continuing into the future by 2030? And so basically it's simply a comparison of what's necessary to meet the SDG and the recent rate of progress since SDGs have been adopted. So the right-hand panel, I have a nice example from the United States, CO2 emissions. So you can see the country's CO2 emissions are declining somewhat, but it's not at all at a rate fast enough to meet that SDG target by 2030. And that's why we give them a sort of stagnating performance. And with that, I have finished my summary of the methodology. I hope that was clear for everyone. And if not, feel free to ask questions at the end. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Finn.
Thank you, Grayson. Everyone, if you've made it this far, congratulations, you've made it through the math section of this presentation. Now we wanted to take the next 20 minutes or so to talk to you about the actual findings from our report. And there's 2 things we want to talk about. One is the key findings from the report. So, you know, the overall SDG index ranking, sort of the big challenges and trends that we're seeing at the global scale. We want to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on sustainable development goals. And then we want to move from the global context to the local context and look specifically at Belgium. What are the results for Belgium from the Sustainable Development Report? What are the results? What are some of the trends that we are seeing? And then importantly, we also want to talk about the issue of spillover impacts. And some of you may already be familiar with the term spillover impacts, which is great if you are. If not, spillover impacts, just quickly, I will go more in depth later, but just quickly, spillover impacts are the positive or negative impacts that a country generates on other countries through its consumption, trade, or policies. Don't worry, we'll go more in depth in a second. So let's start with the key findings from Sustainable Development Report 2021. And the first one, which probably come not as a big surprise, is that COVID-19 has led to a decline in overall SDG index progress as measured by our SDG index score. So Grayson was speaking about this SDG index score is something that we calculate from a scale from 0, which means it's the worst possible score that one country can get, to 100, which is the best possible score, meaning that all SDGs have been achieved. And so on this chart that you see right here, we have calculated the world average SDG index score, right? So this is measuring how close the world is to having achieved all 17 sustainable development goals, 100 meaning that they have achieved all of them. And we did this for the last 5 years to track over time how the world has developed on the SDGs. And that's where we can see in the last year, between 2019 to 2020, due to COVID, for the first time since the adoption of the SDGs, we are seeing a reversal in SDG progress. And this reversal in SDG progress is driven primarily by 2 things. First, by an increase in poverty, particularly extreme poverty, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa that you can see on the left, but also in Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, in yellow on the chart. And then the other reason is the increased unemployment rate, particularly, for example, in OECD countries. Now, these 2 are primarily economic consequences of COVID-19. And the important thing to say about the impacts of COVID-19 is that actually a lot of data at the international level, at the comparable level, is not yet available about the impact of COVID-19. So, a lot of the impacts of the pandemic, for example, on inequalities, gender inequalities, but also inequalities in terms of educational outcomes, is not yet available. Generally, at the international level, we're looking at data lags of 2 to 3 years for indicators. So right now, we're looking at data from 2019 or 2018. And so, that's why we cannot actually get a sense of the full extent of the impact of COVID-19 on Sustainable Development Goals. And that's also why we expect that this decline that we are seeing right here is actually underestimated at the moment and will become more pronounced as more data becomes available. Nevertheless, I wanted to share just a few other examples of the impact of COVID-19 that we have seen from the data that we already have. One is related to CO2 emissions, where we saw a steep reduction in CO2 emissions actually in the initial phases of COVID-19 during the lockdown. But then these CO2 emissions quickly bounced back to pre-pandemic levels at the end of the lockdown. So from the data that we have at the moment, COVID-19 has not led to a sustainable reduction in CO2 emissions, at least not from the pandemic itself. It will be up to countries to now use COVID sort of as an opportunity to transform their systems and structures to reduce carbon emissions. And the other thing that I wanted to share, just because it's still very important, is inequalities and inequities related to COVID-19. Here I have the example of inequities related to vaccine distribution, where vaccine rollout in high-income countries, of course, is very far developed. But when you look at low-income countries, there's still a very, very small proportion of people that have been able to get vaccinated so far. And inequalities is not just about vaccines. There's other inequalities, many inequalities that have been widened by COVID-19. And like so many crises that we have in the world, they always hit those that are already marginalized or poor the most, and are widening existing inequalities. So I just wanted to bring up this point of inequalities in the context of COVID-19. The other interesting thing that we can see with this chart here doesn't relate to COVID-19, but relates to the overall progress on the Sustainable Development Goals so far. And that point is that progress so far has been insufficient. When we replot this graph here on a scale from 0 to 100, right, which is the full range of the SDG index score, it looks something like this. And what you'll see on this is that the progress actually has been very flat over the last 5 years. And so the progress is very much insufficient, and it's not just slightly insufficient, it is vastly insufficient, critically insufficient for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And so this is a very important message and takeaway that we cannot emphasize enough, is that countries at the moment are not doing enough to live up to the commitments that they have set in 2015. Then we have the SDG index rankings that we publish every year, where we rank all 193 UN member states according to their overall SDG index score. This year, I'm showing here the top 20 countries on this ranking. This year, this ranking is led by 3 Northern European countries, as has been the case in the past years. Finland is at the very top, followed by Sweden and Denmark. although it's important to say that even Finland at the very top only has an SDG index score of about 86 out of 100. So there's still a lot of room for improvement, and none of these countries shown here should kind of lean back and cruise along. All countries on this list are facing significant challenges in at least one SDG, and most of the countries here are facing significant challenges in several SDGs. One important thing, or one interesting thing that stands out in this ranking, is that OECD and EU countries perform very well. So out of these top 20 countries, 18 are OECD member states and 16 are EU member states. And partially, of course, this is because more advanced economies with higher income levels generally perform better on the rankings. The SDGs have many socioeconomic dimensions to them. But we also have countries, like the United States and Australia that are very economically advanced, but that perform quite poorly in terms of the ranking. Like the US is somewhere in the 30s. And so I think what we're seeing here also a little bit is just that there's a lot of alignment between the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals and the principles of the European Union, the idea of a social market democracy and the idea of combining human well-being with environmental flourishing. So they fit very well together, and also the idea of fighting inequalities and focusing on equality as a key objective, and this is why we're seeing this reflected in these rankings as well. Then I wanted to take some time to look at 3 key issue areas that we are seeing universally across the world. Of course, depending on which region you look at, you will have different priorities. But I wanted to point out 3 that we're really seeing across the entire globe. And the first one is related to inequalities. I'm showing here the map of SDG 10, reduce inequalities, where again, we're using this traffic light color scheme where green means SDG achieved, red means that there's really major challenges, yellow means there's some challenges, orange means there's significant challenges. So what you see is a lot of red and orange on this map, which means that there's a lot of problems related to inequalities. This also concerns SDG 5 on gender inequalities. The map looks very similar. And these are inequalities both within countries, right? So inequalities that exist within a country, but then also importantly, inequalities between countries. That is also a very important area. We're seeing large disparities between regions and between countries. The second universal challenge that we're seeing is related to climate action and the climate crisis. What you're seeing here is CO2 emissions. Again, a lot of red. You also have some green here. That's from countries where CO2 emissions are below 2 tons per capita, right? Which is the target of the Paris Climate Agreement. But there's a lot of red here. And of course, this is an issue that affects all countries because climate change is a global phenomenon and all countries are really affected by this. And yes, and I mean, we have especially European countries, North America in red here because they share a larger proportion of the burden for tackling climate change as their per capita CO2 emissions are relatively higher than other countries. And then the third issue that we see across the globe is related to biodiversity issues. So here's a map of SDG 15, life on land. And then also this relates to SDG 14, life below water, where almost everything is red. And this is really reflective of the biodiversity crisis that we are seeing in the world with reduction in species diversity, lots of species dying, but also deforestation, pollution of natural environments, both on land and at sea, overfishing, issues like that. So those are really three issues that we're seeing transversally across the globe. Now, there's many other issues that are in our report related to policy tracking, tracking kind of the actions and efforts that countries are making, related to financing for the SDGs, related to data for the SDGs, the need for real-time data, the data gaps that exist, and so on, which will not go into detail at this point, but I just wanted to mention it because they are part of the report as well. And so if you're interested in those, feel free to have a look at the report and dive more into those sections. Instead, what I want to do now is to look at the results for Belgium, specifically to move from the global to the local context and have a look at what the report tells us about Belgium. So what you have here is the country profile for Belgium. You know, you already saw the SDG index rank. That's in the top left here. Belgium is ranked number 5. It's very good, very good. An SDG index score of 82, which also means there's quite some room left for improvement and quite some work left to do to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And then below you have what's called the SDG index dashboard that Grayson already mentioned, again, using this traffic light color scheme from green to red. Green, again, means SDG achieved, yellow, that there are some challenges, orange, significant challenge, and red, major challenges. And then you also have next to each SDG, the trend, the arrow, which is a trend dimension, which is based on the last 5 years of data for each SDG, where we estimate whether, or where we assess whether current rate of progress is sufficient for achieving the goal by 2030. And the green arrow going up, like you have, for example, in SDG 1, means that Belgium is on track to achieve that SDG. The yellow arrow to the top right means that there's progress, but it's insufficient to achieve the SDG by 2030. Then you have the orange arrow going to the right, like you have on SDG 13, which means that the progress is stagnant. There's not really any progress that we're seeing. And then you also have the red arrow going down, which means that progress is reversing. And that's perhaps the first insight that we can get from this profile here, is that there's no SDG where progress is reversing. And that is very good. That's actually makes Belgium stand out quite a lot from other countries, where in many countries, actually, there is progress reversing on at least one of the SDGs. And so for Belgium, that is not the case. For individual indicators, there's some where progress is reversing, but at the goal level, not. I'll show an example of an indicator with reversing progress in a little bit. And then what we can see, of course, is there's one SDG that we consider as having been achieved in Belgium. That's SDG 1 on no poverty. So both in terms of absolute poverty and relative poverty, Belgium performs really, really well in the international comparison. Then what we can see is that there's 4 SDGs where Belgium is on track to achieving the SDGs. That is on SDG 5 on gender equality, on decent work and economic growth, SDG 8, SDG 10 on reduced inequalities, and SDG 15, life on land. And this is quite noteworthy because the SDGs where Belgium is on track are the SDGs, some of the SDGs that we just identified as being a global kind of challenge for most countries, right? The inequalities, SDG 5 and 10, are big challenges in the international perspective, and also is SDG 15 on biodiversity. So Belgium is actually doing quite well on them. For example, if you look at the gender wage gap, Belgium has one of the lowest gender wage gaps among OECD member states, and that's really fantastic. And then also, if we take a look at the mean area that's protected in freshwater sites, important to biodiversity. So this is, protection of natural habitats that are very important for biodiversity, both in freshwater sites, but also in sites on land, terrestrial sites. Belgium is also doing quite well on that, which is of course related to SDG 15 biodiversity. Then what we're also seeing, of course, we cannot ignore are the 2 red SDGs here where Belgium is facing major challenges. That is SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production. And that's why I'm very glad that today in the session, we have many participants who come from the private sector, who are hopefully working on exactly these issues related to sustainable consumption and production, making sure that we reduce the amount of waste, that we reduce the carbon footprint of our products, that we reduce the nitrogen emissions, sulfur dioxide emissions related to our products. And then we have a big issue with climate action, like so many countries in the world where urgent action is needed. Belgium has a quite high footprint of CO2 emissions per capita. So there urgent action is needed. And also in terms of the share of renewable energy, there's quite some room for improvement in Belgium as well. I mean, this indicator is related to SDG 7 on renewable energy, but it's also, of course, related to SDG 13 on climate action. So with that, let me see, I think we have, yeah, so that's at the goal level. There's some interesting things also when we go at the indicator level. I think I only brought one indicator to look at briefly because I didn't want to go overboard. But when you go to our website, to our interactive dashboard, actually you are able to explore all of the results in a lot of detail and go for each goal, not just the goal level, but look at the individual indicators to understand what is driving the poor performance on each goal. But for today, I just brought one more. This is an example of an indicator where Belgium actually has a reversing progress. This is the prevalence of obesity. This is an indicator related to SDG 2, no hunger. As some of you will probably know, SDG 2 is not just about eradicating hunger, but it's also about healthy and sustainable diets. And it's also about sustainable agriculture. And so obesity is very much an issue that is related to SDG 2. And it's a very important issue in OECD countries where obesity has been continuously growing for the last 20 years. And I mean, Belgium, compared to other OECD countries, is doing still okay, but also with a growing share of obese people, with 20% of the population, adult population being obese. So an important issue related to healthy diets and also, again, related to making sure that the products that people have access to are healthy and sustainably produced. With that, I wanted to use the last 5 minutes to talk about a very important issue in the field of sustainable development, but also specifically for Belgium, which are the spillover impacts. Again, these are the negative and positive impacts that a country like Belgium generates on other countries through its trade, consumption, and policies. So for example, if you buy something in Belgium that has been produced in China, then the CO2 emissions for that product are attributed to China, even though we would argue you as the final consumer in Belgium share at least a partial responsibility for those emissions that are now counted towards China. And so, you know, we live in a globalized world with lots of international supply chains. And so, of course, our products come from lots of different parts of the world. And so there's impacts in lots of different parts of the world. And it's important that we measure them and that we make them trackable so that we can understand what our impacts are and so that then we can work to reduce our negative impacts in different parts of the world. And so one example of why these spillover impacts are so important is visible on this chart here, which shows the CO2 emissions from the United Kingdom. And what you have here on the light gray, on the gray line, is just the CO2 emissions that were originating from the UK, right? So these are not including the imports. And if you look just at that, then you see a decline from 700 million metric tons of CO2 to 400, which, you know, you look at that and you think everything is going great. We're moving in a great direction. But then when you take into account actually the imported CO2 emissions, which is this purple line, you get a very different story. And suddenly you look at 40, 50 years of progress or of time, and you see that there has been very little progress. In fact, from 700 million metric tons to perhaps 650 million metric tons. And that's why it's so important that we consider our spillover impacts, because our way of achieving sustainable development goals cannot be to outsource our problems to other countries, right? We cannot outsource our dirty industries to other countries and then import the final goods that have been produced. We cannot outsource our steel industries and solve our climate crisis, quote unquote, by getting rid of our dirty industries and moving them to China or somewhere else and then just importing the steel from there. And that's why it's so important that we measure them to avoid doing exactly that, and so that we can work on improving our supply chains. In the Sustainable Development Report, we have 3 groups of spillover indicators. It's very difficult to calculate the spillover indicators. I'm not going into details of how that's done, but it's very difficult to do, and that's why we have limited data on spillover indicators at the moment. But it's a really an active field of research that we're very much working on. At the moment, we have 3 groups of spillover indicators: environmental and social impacts embodied into trade. So these are related to pesticides, water consumption, sulfur dioxide emissions, nitrogen emissions, CO2 emissions, some biodiversity threats embodied into products that we consume, and then also fatal accidents that happen for products that we consume. So for example, fatal accidents that happen in Bangladesh for textiles that are produced in Bangladesh and then bought in Belgium. And then we also have spillover indicators related to economy and finance, related to official development assistance. That would be an example of a positive spillover impact. So supporting other countries financially, and then also some indicators related to tax havens and shifted profits. And then we have a third category called security, where we have an indicator related to the weapons exports into other countries. And so just a very quick look at Belgian spillover impacts here. So Belgian, we calculate a spillover score, again, from a scale from 0 to 100, where 100 is the best possible score, meaning you have no negative impacts and only positive impacts on the world. 0 means you have all negative impacts. Belgium has a score of 62, which is quite bad internationally. Remember, the SDG index score was 82, so the spillover score is quite lower, and the rank is only 147. So this is a really important issue for Belgium. I brought also what you can see on the right, the indicator breakdown, and you have the little circle, again, using the same color scheme from green to red. And we see that there are major issues specifically related to the environmental aspects. So the supply chains for Belgian products are particularly negatively impacting the environment in other countries. So, you know, the nitrogen emissions, the CO2 emissions, and also biodiversity. And then the last thing I'll say about the spillovers is just that we have a great tool that you can use to understand and dive more into the details of these spillover impacts, where you can actually see for Belgium or for any other countries, in which countries those negative impacts are being created. So on this map, for example, you can see that CO2 emissions are being generated, for example, in China, in Germany, and France. But you can also do this for the fatal accidents. You can do this for the water, the imported water consumption, the sulfur dioxide emissions, and so on. And then before we move to our Q&A, let me just briefly recap some of the key points and key findings that I just shared. First of all, it's that COVID-19 has led to a reversal of progress on sustainable development goals, driven primarily by increased poverty and unemployment. But as we said, there's a lot of data that's still missing, so we do not have a good sense of the full extent of the pandemic. There's 3 big challenges internationally that we're seeing across all countries, related to inequalities, related to climate and the climate crisis, and then related also to biodiversity loss. And then in Belgium, we are seeing 2 big challenges, one related to SDG 12, related to sustainable consumption and production, where we need to take some action, and also SDG 13. And then the other big issue for Belgium being the spillover impacts, where it's very important, actually, that, and yes, that I say this because the policy implication of the spillover impacts is not that we should have less trade. The spillover impacts are not an anti-globalization agenda. The policy implication of the spillover impacts and the application of spillover impacts is that we need to make our supply chains sustainable and ethical. Not that there should be less trade, or we should have less kind of global collaboration. So thank you very much for your attention. And we look forward to kind of any questions and comments that you may have. And of course, here are our email addresses. You are so super welcome to email us as well at any point with other questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Finn. Thank you, Grayson. It was really, really interesting. And I will, as I said before, I will share your presentation and a recording of your presentation. We received many questions, so I suggest to start by the first one. Do low-income countries have the same target as the economically advanced countries? I could imagine for them to reach them is far more challenging.
Yes, so that's a really good question about the targets. So because in the Global Sustainable Development Report, we want to have comparable comparisons, comparable ratings and scores for countries, we do have to use the same targets for all countries. And so what this means is that, yes, it's true that sometimes you'll see that European countries are doing green on certain indicators, where sub-Saharan African countries are doing really bad. And that's just because we have to have comparable data for all the countries. So what we try to do in these cases is localize these sorts of indicators with regional and subnational additions. So for example, you see on, for example, poverty indicators, we have much more strict thresholds in our European report that we publish every year in November or December with the European Commission. Or in other regional editions, we can sort of localize the indicator framework to the context. But it's true, it is a problem when you're doing a global report that sometimes you have sort of unequal schemes just because we have to have equal targets for all the countries. But yeah, that is the case. A very good question.
Maybe you want to pick in the question, or what for you? What works the best for you?
Yes. I mean, we can continue on chronologically. I think there's a few questions here related to environmental performance and the overall SDG index score. I see a question here from Andreas and from Willie as well. With Willie, actually, we had some exchanges when our report came out. I'll just briefly mention this because it's great. We're always really happy to engage with people on the report and to have kind of critical conversations about it. And with Willie, we had a great exchange about the importance is related to, especially this, the issue is when you look just at the overall SDG index score, you see a lot of countries at the top of the list that are causing a lot of environmental problems in the world. And so the reason for this is that in the SDGs, the socioeconomic dimensions, right? So the SDGs related to poverty, the SDGs related to inequalities, to access to sanitation, there's quite a lot of them compared to SDGs related to climate. And so just by that nature, the socioeconomic dimensions weigh more than the environmental dimensions. And that's why countries can be perform really poorly on SDG 13, for example, but still do very well in the rankings. And that's why we always advise people and try to emphasize that it is very important to go beyond the rankings. You know, rankings are just an entry point to the results, and it's very important to dive into the actual dashboard for each country to really see where the challenges are. Because if you just look at the rankings, you might get the impression, okay, you know, Belgium is ranked number 5, there's nothing to do here. But if you look at the SDG dashboards, actually, there's a lot of challenges. And the other part of the answer is that this is exactly the reason why we started developing the spillover index and spillover score to put into context a little bit the really good performance on the SDG index score, and to show that all of these countries at the top of the rankings have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Maybe another question. Did you pick one you find interesting? Otherwise, I will choose one. Here I have one from Sonia. Do all the SDGs have the same weights, or do you modulate some of them?
Yeah, so that's actually getting at Finn's point before. So all SDGs are rated the same when we aggregate them to get the overall score. And that's exactly why you see that a lot of countries that might have really bad performance on SDGs 12 and 13 have overall good scores on the SDG index. And I mean, something interesting that came up actually when we did our statistical audit is that you'll see that SDGs 12 and 13 are not correlated with the rest of the goals in the SDG index. And that's really just emphasizing that countries really haven't started to decouple. So progress on overall performance is really completely unrelated with progress on lowering CO2 emissions and decarbonizing economies. Yes, so
Thank you.
Mhm.
There is some question about the spillover index. One from Brieux, determining the spillover index seems indeed very complex, but it seems essential, in particular for a country like Belgium that imports a big part of its consumption. As with research events, will the spillover index be considered as important as the SDG index? Is it possible to combine both index to have more representative index of countries' responsibilities to achieve the SDGs both internally and externally?
That's a very good question. Yes, I mean, I'm not sure if we will want to combine the two indices, but we are giving, we're trying to give the spillover index a great amount of visibility. So on our country profiles, both in the report and on our interactive dashboard, whenever you see the country and the SDG index score, you also have direct access to the spillover index score. So we really do try to, you know, put it very, very high up on the page and to make it very visible and to give a lot of attention to it. And in terms of kind of, you know, aside from the SDG index, the work that we do in SDSN together with partners also, we're actually doing a lot of work on spillovers just because there's so much interest in it. And so, you know, we have that tool where that's dedicated exclusively to spillovers for exploring bilaterally between each country where spillover impacts are created. We're doing a lot of research work specifically on individual supply chains. And then actually we just started a new project called the Global Common Stewardship Index, which is focused exclusively on environmental issues and tracking countries' performance on environmental issues. And there again, spillovers are a very, very big component of that index. So, you know, long answer short is probably at the SDG index. We'll try to keep this balance and continue having a separate SDG index score and a separate spillover score, but continue to giving both very high visibility. But then what we're doing is in other projects bringing in spillovers in a very big way.
Thank you, Finn. There is many other questions. If you want to pick up one.
Yeah, I think I see some just related to the data and some of the technical aspects. So I saw one question about the dots next to SDG 12. Basically, these gray dots mean that we don't have trend data for these indicators or for these goals. And so as Finn was mentioning, these spillover metrics are actually really hard to obtain data for. The process for doing it requires a lot of modeling in MRO tables. And so it's one of our real agendas to sort of push more recent and disaggregated data for these metrics. And so, yes, it's really one of our key priorities, but the time being for this report, we weren't able to really show trends over time for a lot of the spillover metrics. So that's why you have those dots. And then I just see another question about data availability. So are we giving ourselves sort of free congratulations based on old data? What if we're comparing data with countries that have more recent data? This is another good question. So not all countries have the same data points from the same years. And so actually in these country profiles, you see where I have all the sort of the years, the data points, the dashboards and the trends. So actually see the year for every data point that's published for an indicator. And so part of our goal is of course to track performance in SDGs, but it's also to sort of encourage better data availability and investment statistical capacity of the NSOs. And so in general, we try to use indicators where we have extremely recent data, but in cases where an indicator is just really essential, where we can't say we've covered the SDG without this dimension, we're sort of obliged to use maybe less recent data, but the goal always being that we want to encourage countries to submit these data more quickly to international organizations and to get these data harmonized and publicized more quickly. And then just one last question. I see the technical aspects from Evelyn about how spillover impacts are attributed. So they are indeed attributed to the country where they are finally purchased and destination. So for example, countries where a good is simply imported and re-exported and done a little bit of processing, these countries are not the ones that receive the actual attribution of its spillover impact. It's the final country of consumption, so where that good is consumed, where we attribute the NO2 emissions, the SO2 emissions, the CO2 emissions for that good. So yeah, just a quick explanation of some key methodological aspects for me.
And then there's another point also to this question from Evelyn about related to spillover impacts, right? So another way to describe the spillover impacts sometimes is to say consumption based impacts and production-based impacts. So the consumption-based ones are take into account all the things that we consume, you know, whether it's produced in China or somewhere else, and the production-based ones are everything that's produced in Belgium. And there are some indices that exist that take only into account only consumption-based ones, because you could make the argument in some way that in the end of the day, it matters what you consume and not so much what you're producing within each country. We have taken the approach of actually tracking both. So we take into account both the consumption-based ones, but also the production-based ones. And the reason for that is that both are important, because the production-based ones, those are directly, you know, like if we tracked only the consumption-based ones, then I don't know, for example, China could completely take no responsibility for its dirty exports, because all of those would be directly attributed to the importing countries. And that's why we also include the production-based ones, because we want to hold countries accountable to also reducing, cleaning up their export sectors. So it's a dual responsibility that's shared between the importing country, but also the exporting country. And that's why in the SDG index, we track both the production-based ones and also the consumption-based impacts.
Thank you very much, Finn and Grayson. We have time maybe for one last question, if you want to choose one. Otherwise,
I think we've answered a good bit of questions. I just wanted to reiterate that all of our data is publicly available on our website, so please feel free to check out sdgindex.org. You can download the report, and you can access the data visualization tool where you can play with the data. You can select your own countries, you can select indicators, you can see all the years. You can have the Excel databases, you can play with data yourself, you can check correlations between indicators if you want to. Really, everything is transparent, everything is available. The statistical audit is also on our website, so please feel free to check out the materials. And we also just really thank you for your time today. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present to you.
thank you very much to both of you. It was super clear. I learned a lot of things. I'm sure the participants as well. You put the links in the chats at the beginning of the presentation, but I put it again. So please use it. And I guess I can share your email address. I will put you in CC of my email so people can reach you. And thanks again for everything, and see you soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.